Imagine two pendulums suspended from the same wooden beam, each swinging at its own erratic pace, chaotic and disconnected. At first, their movements seem entirely independent, even oppositional. But if you watch long enough, something uncanny begins to happen. Without any visible force, without wires or commands, their rhythms start to align. One swing echoes the other. Soon, they move in perfect synchrony, as if sharing a single breath. This phenomenon, first observed by Christian Huygens in the 17th century, is called entrainment. It's not magic. It's physics. And remarkably, the human mind operates by the same invisible laws. In conversation, we are constantly sending and receiving subtle signals, not just through words, but through posture, tone, rhythm, and energy. When someone is agitated, speaking quickly, gesturing emphatically, their nervous system broadcasts urgency. If you respond with calm detachment, you create dissonance. Their brain senses a mismatch, a stranger in their emotional landscape, and instinctively tightens its defenses. But if you gently mirror their cadence, their volume, even their breathing pattern, something shifts. You become familiar. Safe. Their subconscious whispers, "This person understands me." That's the essence of the mirror move, not imitation, but attunement. Mirroring is not about parroting someone's anger or adopting their frustration as your own. It's far more nuanced. It's about matching the structure of their energy, how fast they speak, how much space they take up, how intensely they lean into a point, without absorbing the emotional charge. For a few seconds, you meet them where they are. Then, almost imperceptibly, you begin to shift. You soften your voice. You lengthen your pauses. You exhale slowly. And because your nervous systems have already begun to sync, they follow. It's not persuasion in the traditional sense. It's co-regulation. You don't argue them into calm, you invite them into it. Consider a real moment. A colleague storms into your office, voice sharp with accusation. You never include me in decisions. The instinct might be to defend, to counter with logic. "That's not true. I emailed you last week." But that only escalates. Instead, try this. Match their intensity just enough to show you're fully present. "I hear how upset you are, and you're right, this matters." Then, after a breath, lower your voice slightly. "Let's figure out what went wrong, together." Notice the pivot? You acknowledge their emotional reality without conceding factual ground. And by modulating your own energy, you gave their nervous system permission to relax. This technique is rooted in decades of neuroscience. Mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we act and when we observe others acting, form the biological basis for empathy and social bonding. When you mirror someone authentically, you activate these neural pathways, creating a sense of shared experience. It's why we feel in sync with certain people, why conversations with them feel effortless. The mirror move simply harnesses this natural process with intention. But here lies its quiet paradox. The more skillfully you mirror, the less it feels like strategy, and the more it feels like presence. And that's the razor's edge. If your mirroring is mechanical, if it's deployed with cold calculation, it becomes mimicry, and mimicry repels. People sense inauthenticity like a draft in a sealed room. The mirror move only works when it springs from genuine curiosity, from a desire to understand rather than to dominate. It's not about steering someone like a puppet, it's about walking beside them until the path naturally bends in a new direction. This reveals a deeper truth about human interaction. We are not solitary thinkers debating in a vacuum. We are resonant beings, constantly tuning ourselves to the frequencies around us. Influence, then, isn't about overpowering another's signal, it's about harmonizing with it, then gently introducing a new note. In a world that glorifies loudness and force, the mirror move is a quiet rebellion. It says, I don't need to shout to be heard. I only need to listen well enough to echo back what you're truly saying, then guide us both toward calmer waters. And once you've matched their rhythm, once you've built that bridge of shared energy, the next step is to stand firmly upon it. Because rapport alone isn't enough. To truly shift the course of an argument, you must project something magnetic, something undeniable, even if your hands are shaking beneath the surface. You must project certainty. Not arrogance. Not rigidity. But the quiet, unwavering clarity that makes others lean in and believe. Why do we so often yield to the voice that declares, this is how it is, while doubting the one that offers, I think this might be true? It's not logic that draws us, it's relief. The human mind is wired to seek resolution, to close loops, to banish the discomfort of the unknown. Uncertainty is a low-grade hum of anxiety, a cognitive static that fatigues the spirit. Certainty, by contrast, feels like solid ground beneath shifting sands. And this is the heart of the certainty trap. We mistake the feeling of confidence for the substance of truth. It's not that the certain person is always right, it's that their unwavering tone soothes our nervous system, and in that moment of relief, we grant them authority. This isn't mere perception, it's neurobiology. Studies in social psychology reveal that people consistently rate confident speakers as more competent, knowledgeable, and trustworthy, even when their actual accuracy is no better than hesitant peers. In one experiment, participants preferred advice from a doctor who spoke decisively over one who expressed appropriate caution, despite identical medical recommendations. Why? Because doubt, however honest, triggers our threat detection systems. Certainty, even feigned, signals safety. It whispers, you can stop thinking now. I've got this. So how do you step into this current without drowning in it? The key lies not in fabricating knowledge, but in refining delivery. Replace qualifiers that erode your presence. I feel like, sort of, maybe, I could be wrong, but these phrases, though humble, broadcast internal conflict, and the listener absorbs that tension. Instead, speak with the quiet finality of observable fact. Say, the evidence points to, rather than I believe the evidence might suggest. Frame your perspective as a conclusion drawn from reasoning, not a fragile opinion trembling in the wind. This isn't arrogance. It's clarity dressed in calm. You're not claiming omniscience, you're offering a stable vantage point from which to view the issue. Consider two colleagues presenting the same proposal. One says, this could work, I suppose, if we're lucky. The other says, this approach aligns with our goals and past results. Who inspires confidence? Not because their idea is superior, but because their language eliminates friction in the listener's mind. The brain prefers a clear map, even if it's slightly inaccurate, over a perfectly detailed one that's shrouded in fog. Yet here lies the trap's shadow. The very act of performing certainty can calcify your thinking. When you speak as if you've reached the end of inquiry, you subtly close the door to new information. True wisdom thrives in the tension between conviction and humility, the ability to hold a position firmly while remaining open to revision. The ethical practitioner of the certainty trap understands this duality. They project steadiness in the moment to create psychological safety, but privately honor the fluidity of truth. They know that confidence is a vessel, not the water it carries. This raises a quiet ethical question. Is it deceptive to sound certain when you're not? Perhaps, but only if your aim is domination. If your intention is to reduce chaos, to offer a temporary anchor in a storm of confusion, then this performance becomes an act of service. Think of a pilot speaking calmly during turbulence. We're experiencing some rough air, but everything is under control. They may feel fear, but they cloak it, not to lie, but to prevent panic. In argument, too, certainty can be a form of care, a way to hold space so reason can return. Still, beware the seduction of your own performance. The more you rely on the certainty trap, the more you may begin to believe your own act, confusing rhetorical strength with intellectual infallibility. The wisest among us know that the most powerful statements are often those that carry quiet confidence and implicit openness. Based on what we know now, this is the clearest path forward. That now is the hinge. It acknowledges time, change, and the limits of human understanding, all while projecting resolve. And so, armed with this steady presence, you stand ready. But what happens when the other person doesn't meet your calm with calm? What if their frustration erupts, their voice sharpens, their words spill out in a torrent of emotion? Instinct screams, match their volume, defend your ground, push back harder. But that is the path of escalation. The true master of psychological fluency knows that in the face of rising heat, the most powerful response is not fire, but coolness. Not resistance, but reversal. Because sometimes, to win an argument, you must first lower your voice and invite them into silence. In a storm, the loudest wave isn't the strongest, it's the most chaotic. It crashes, foams, and recedes, leaving only noise in its wake. The deepest ocean, by contrast, moves with silent power, its currents shaping continents without a sound. Human conflict mirrors this truth. When voices rise in anger, when words sharpen into weapons, the instinctive response is to meet fire with fire. To shout back. To prove you are not small. But this only feeds the storm. The calm reversal asks you to do something far more radical, to lower your voice when there's rises. Not out of submission, but as an act of quiet command. When someone yells, their nervous system is in overdrive. The amygdala, the brain's ancient alarm system, has hijacked reason, flooding the body with adrenaline, preparing for battle. In that state, they are not listening for nuance, they are scanning for threat. If you respond with equal volume, you confirm their fear, this is a fight. But if you respond with softness, a slower pace, a gentler tone, a deliberate calm, you introduce a dissonance their brain cannot immediately categorize. Instead of the expected escalation, they encounter stillness. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something remarkable happens, their emotional momentum stalls. The amygdala falters. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason, gets a chance to re-engage. You haven't won the argument yet, but you've reclaimed the space where it can be resolved. Try this the next time tension flares. Lean in slightly, not aggressively, but with attentive presence. Let your shoulders relax. Drop your voice to just above a whisper, as if sharing a secret. Say something simple and grounding, I hear how important this is to you. Notice what you've done. You haven't agreed. You haven't backed down. You've acknowledged their emotional reality without validating every claim. And in doing so, you've shifted the entire dynamic. The battlefield is no longer one of volume and dominance, but of connection and clarity. Their anger, once a weapon, now is nowhere to land. It begins to dissolve in the quiet. This technique is not new. It echoes through ancient wisdom traditions. The Tao Te Ching reminds us that the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest. In martial arts, the principle of Aikido, blending with an opponent's force rather than opposing it, is the foundation of true mastery. The calm reversal is verbal Aikido. You don't resist the attack, you redirect its energy. By refusing to escalate, you rob the conflict of its fuel. And in that vacuum, reason returns. But this requires something rare, self-mastery. To stay calm when provoked is not passive, it is profoundly active. It demands that you hold your center while the world spins around you. Most people mistake loudness for strength because it's visible, immediate, and visceral. Quietness, by contrast, is invisible labor. It happens in the breath you consciously slow, the words you choose not to say, the pulse you refuse to let race. And that invisibility is precisely what makes it so powerful. Because when someone expects a storm and meets a still pond, they cannot help but look into it and see themselves. This reversal also exposes a troubling cultural assumption, that volume equals validity. We reward the loudest voices in meetings, in media, in politics. We equate passion with truth, intensity with integrity. But history is littered with quiet truths drowned out by thunderous falsehoods. The calm reversal challenges this illusion. It asserts that presence is not measured in decibels, but in depth. Silence is not absence, it is distilled presence. It is the space where listening becomes possible, where understanding can take root, where real change begins. Of course, this approach is not a magic spell. It won't disarm a truly malicious actor or resolve deep systemic injustice with a whisper. But in the everyday conflicts that shape our relationships, misunderstandings, frustrations, clashing perspectives, it is transformative. It turns adversaries into collaborators, not by overpowering them, but by inviting them back into their own humanity. And once that space is open, once the storm is quieted enough for thought to return, the next move is not to explain, not to justify, but to inquire. Because sometimes, the most disarming response to an accusation is not a defense, but a question, one that gently turns the mirror back toward the accuser, not to shame, but to invite reflection. A question that doesn't seek to win, but to understand, and in doing so, to be understood. What if the thing they're so sure about, the belief they cling to like armor, is the very thing that's keeping them from seeing clearly? We've all stood on the receiving end of an accusation hurled like a stone. You never listen. You don't care. You always do this. In that moment, the instinct is to deflect, deny, or retaliate, to build a wall of defense against the incoming blow. But walls only echo the conflict back. The question twist offers a different path, not to block the stone, but to catch it gently, and hand it back with a question. What makes you feel I'm not listening? With those few words, everything shifts. This simple reframe performs a quiet alchemy. First, it validates the emotion beneath the accusation. You're not saying they're right, you're acknowledging that their feeling is real, and that matters. This alone begins to lower defenses, because being heard is often more important than being agreed with. Second, it shifts the focus from your behavior, which you cannot control, to their perception, which they must now examine. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about proving your innocence, but about exploring the roots of their frustration. And third, it invites self-reflection. By asking them to articulate the why behind their claim, you turn their certainty into inquiry. The accusation, once a blunt weapon, becomes a puzzle they must solve for themselves. Consider the difference. If someone snaps, "You're so selfish," and you reply, "I'm not selfish," you've entered a tug-of-war with no winner. But if you respond, "Help me understand, what did I do that felt selfish to you?" you've changed the game entirely. Now, they must move from emotional reaction to cognitive articulation. And in that transition, something subtle happens. The heat of the moment cools just enough for reason to slip through the cracks. Often, as they search for a concrete example, they realize the feeling was disproportionate, misattributed, or based on a misunderstanding. They may even soften, "Well, I guess it wasn't that you're selfish, it's just that I've been feeling overlooked lately." The real issue emerges, not from your defense, but from their own introspection. This is the power of the well-placed question. Unlike statements, which land and sit like stones, questions ripple. They create movement. they open neural pathways that rigid assertions close. Neuroscientists have found that when we're asked a genuine question, one that invites exploration rather than interrogation, the brain's default mode network activates, associated with self-referential thought and empathy. In other words, a thoughtful question doesn't just gather information, it changes the internal landscape of the person answering it. But this technique carries a quiet ethical weight. The question twist is not a trap disguised as curiosity. It fails the moment it feels manipulative, when the question is rhetorical, sarcastic, or designed to corner rather than connect. The difference lies in tone, timing, and intent. Ask with genuine openness, not with a smirk hidden in your voice. Lean in, not away. Let your eyes soften. Make it clear you're not seeking to expose, but to understand. Because the goal isn't to make them doubt themselves, it's to help them see more clearly. This approach also reveals a deeper truth about human conflict. Most accusations are not about facts, but about unmet needs. You never listen often means I need to feel heard. You don't care often means I'm afraid I don't matter. The question twist gently uncovers these hidden layers without forcing them into the light. It respects the other person's autonomy, their right to arrive at insight in their own time, on their own terms. And in that space you've created, between accusation and answer, between emotion and explanation, something rare and precious emerges, the possibility of real dialogue. Not performance. Not victory. But mutual discovery. It is in this liminal zone that understanding takes root, watered not by certainty, but by curiosity. And once that space exists, once the other person has begun to speak, to reflect, to unravel their own certainty, the next tool reveals itself. Not more words, not another question, but the deliberate, resonant power of saying nothing at all. Because in the pause that follows their answer, in the quiet that stretches just a moment too long, their own mind begins to work on your behalf. In music, the most powerful note is often the one not played. It's the breath between phrases, the hush after a crescendo, the silence that gives shape to sound. In conversation, the same truth holds, the most potent word is frequently the one you choose not to say. The power pause, the deliberate act of waiting just one beat longer than feels comfortable after someone finishes speaking, is not emptiness. It is charged space. It is a quiet command of time, rhythm, and psychological terrain. And in that stillness, control subtly shifts from the speaker to the listener. When someone finishes a statement, especially a charged one, an accusation, or a declaration, they often do so with a kind of breathless expectation. They await your reaction, denial, agreement, defensiveness. Their nervous system is primed for engagement, ready to volley back whatever you send. But if you respond not with words, but with silence, a calm, steady pause that stretches just beyond the social norm, you disrupt the script. That extra second creates a micro-vacuum, and human nature abhors a vacuum. Most people, uncomfortable with unresolved tension, will rush to fill it. They'll add qualifiers. Well, I don't mean always. They'll backtrack. Actually, maybe I overreacted. Or they'll reveal more than they intended. It's just that. I've been stressed about work, and it spilled over. In trying to ease the discomfort of your silence, they often expose the vulnerability beneath their certainty. This isn't manipulation, it's rhythm. Conversation, like dance, has a tempo. The person who dictates that tempo dictates the emotional climate. When you pause, you signal thoughtfulness, not hesitation. You convey that your words are chosen, not reflexive. And that quiet composure exerts a subtle pressure. It invites the other person to wonder, what are they thinking? Do they see something I don't? That uncertainty is fertile ground. It opens the door for reflection, for nuance, for the kind of self-correction that no argument could ever force. The power pause is especially potent after a question. Ask someone a challenging but fair question. What would success look like to you in this situation? Then say nothing. Let the silence hang. Resist the urge to soften it with take your time or no rush. Just wait. In that space, their mind races to construct a coherent answer, often revealing priorities, fears, or contradictions they hadn't voiced before. The pause becomes a mirror, and in its stillness, they see themselves more clearly. Yet mastering this technique demands something increasingly rare: patience. In an age of instant replies, rapid-fire messaging, and soundbite debates, silence feels like failure. We've been conditioned to equate speed with intelligence, fluency with competence. To hesitate is to seem weak. But this is an illusion. True presence isn't measured in words per minute, but in depth per moment. The power pause is a rebellion against the tyranny of reaction. It says, I will not be rushed. I will not perform. I will let time do its work. This reveals a deeper truth: time, in dialogue, is power. The one who controls the rhythm controls the narrative. A rushed speaker appears anxious, even desperate. A measured one appears grounded, even authoritative. By extending the pause, you reclaim agency over the pace of the exchange. You refuse to be swept into the other person's emotional current. Instead, you create a pool of stillness where clarity can settle. But the pause must be calm, not cold. If your silence feels like judgment or withdrawal, it will harden rather than soften the other person. The key is in your posture, your breath, your eyes. Keep them soft. Let your body remain open. Your silence should feel like an invitation, not a wall. It's the difference between I'm waiting for you to finish digging your hole and I'm giving you room to find your truth. And when that pause ends, when you finally speak, your words land with greater weight. Because they've been preceded by stillness, they carry the resonance of intention. They are not noise. They are signal. And that signal begins not just with what you say, but with how you show up in the room. Because before a single syllable leaves your lips, you've already communicated volumes through your presence, your posture, your gaze, the quiet certainty in your stance. How you present yourself, in those first silent seconds, often matters more than the argument you're about to make. Why do we believe the doctor in a white coat, even before they've uttered a single diagnosis? It's not the stethoscope around their neck or the clipboard in their hand. It's the quiet certainty in their posture, the steady calm in their gaze, the unhurried rhythm of their movements. Long before they speak, we've already decided they know what they're doing. This is the authority effect in action, the unconscious bias that equates presence with competence, and composure with credibility. It's not about titles or credentials, though those help, but about the subtle, nonverbal language of assurance that radiates from someone who occupies their space with quiet command. Authority, in its truest form, is not declared, it is embodied. It lives in the way you stand, spine aligned not with rigidity, but with grounded ease. It's in your eye contact, not a stare, but a steady, unhurried acknowledgement that says, I see you, and I am here. It's in your voice, which resonates not from the tightness of the throat, but from the depth of the diaphragm, a sound that carries weight without volume. These microsignals are processed by the listener's brain faster than conscious thought. Before you've made your first point, their limbic system has already categorized you as someone to trust, to follow, to listen to. This isn't manipulation. It's alignment. You are simply ensuring that your inner knowledge is matched by an outer presence that allows it to be received. Consider two people presenting the same well-researched idea. One fidgets, avoids eye contact, speaks in a rushed, high-pitched tone, and fills pauses with nervous laughter. The other stands with relaxed shoulders, speaks slowly and clearly, and lets silence breathe between sentences. Whose idea feels more credible? Chances are, you lean toward the second, even if the content is identical. This isn't irrational. It's evolutionary. For millennia, humans relied on nonverbal cues to assess safety and competence. A calm demeanor signaled control over one's environment, agitation signaled danger. That wiring hasn't disappeared, it's just operating beneath the surface of modern conversation. But this reveals a troubling paradox: we often judge truth by its packaging. A poorly delivered truth can be dismissed as naive, a confidently delivered falsehood can be embraced as wisdom. The authority effect, then, is a double-edged sword. In the hands of the uninformed, it can amplify error. But in the hands of the knowledgeable, it ensures that insight isn't lost to poor delivery. If you've done the work, if you understand the issue deeply, why let nervous habits, rushed speech, or hesitant posture obscure your message? Authority, when earned through genuine understanding, is not arrogance. It is responsibility. It is the duty to present your truth in a way that honors its value and allows others to receive it without unnecessary friction. This doesn't mean adopting a mask of cold detachment. True authority is warm, not icy. It's the professor who listens intently before responding, the leader who speaks last in a meeting, the mentor whose quiet confidence makes others feel safe to explore. It's not about dominating the room, but about holding it, creating a container where ideas can be examined without fear. The most compelling authorities are those who radiate competence without needing to prove it. They know that real power doesn't announce itself, it simply is. And yet, even the most authoritative presence has its limits. Because facts, no matter how well delivered, rarely move people on their own. Data informs the mind, but it doesn't stir the heart. You can cite statistics about climate change until you're hoarse, but it's the image of a polar bear on a melting ice floe that lingers in memory. You can outline the logic of a policy, but it's the story of the single mother it helps that changes minds. Authority opens the door, but story walks through it. And once you've established credibility through presence, the next step is not to overwhelm with evidence, but to invite with narrative. Because to win an argument, you must first win the imagination. And imagination speaks not in bullet points, but in stories. Data tells. Stories sell. And stories, when woven with care, soothe. They do more than convey information, they create communion. In a world saturated with facts, figures, and forceful opinions, the human mind remains stubbornly resistant to pure logic. We don't change our minds because we're out-argued. We change because we're moved. And nothing moves us like a story. This is the essence of the story hook, not to replace reason, but to prepare the ground for it. Begin not with evidence, but with empathy. Say, let me tell you about someone who faced this, and watch his defenses soften, attention deepens, and your point ceases to feel like an intrusion, and begins to feel like a shared human experience. Neuroscience confirms what poets have always known: the brain processes narrative with extraordinary depth. Studies suggest that stories activate not only the language centers of the brain but also the sensory cortex, the motor regions, and even the areas associated with emotion and social cognition. When you hear the wind howl through the trees, your auditory cortex flickers. When you're told she clenched her fists, your motor neurons subtly echo the gesture. A well-told story doesn't just describe, it simulates. It places the listener inside another's skin, if only for a moment. And in that shared space, resistance melts. Abstract principles, fairness, risk, justice, become flesh and blood. Suddenly, your argument isn't about policy or theory, it's about Maria, who lost her job because of a loophole, or James, who found hope through a program others dismissed. The listener doesn't just understand your point, they feel its weight. This is why emotion opens the door, and logic walks through it. You can present flawless data on income inequality, but it's the image of a child choosing between lunch and a bus fare that lingers in the conscience. You can cite peer-reviewed research on climate change, but it's the farmer watching his ancestral land turn to dust who shifts belief. The story hook doesn't bypass reason, it escorts it past the gatekeepers of skepticism. People don't reject facts because they're ignorant, they reject them because they feel attacked, alienated, or unheard. A story disarms that reflex. It says, "I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to walk with you." But this power carries a profound ethical burden. Stories can deceive as easily as they enlighten. A compelling narrative can cloak falsehood in the garb of truth, wrap bias in the warmth of relatability, and manufacture urgency where none exists. History is littered with movements built not on evidence, but on myth, on stories that stirred hearts while starving minds. The demagogue and the poet use the same tools, the difference lies in intent. The ethical wielder of narrative does not craft stories to manipulate, but to illuminate. They choose examples that are representative, not cherry-picked. They honor complexity, even within simplicity. They tell stories not to replace truth, but to reveal it in a form the human heart can hold. Moreover, the most resonant stories are often the quietest, those that avoid melodrama and instead dwell in specificity. Not people suffer under this law, but every Tuesday, Elena walks 3 miles to the clinic because the nearest bus stop was cut. The detail is the doorway. It invites the listener to imagine the worn soles of her shoes, the weight of her bag, the rhythm of her steps. In that act of imagination, empathy is born, not as an obligation, but as a natural response. And once that empathy is kindled, once the heart is open, logic finds fertile soil. The listener is no longer defending a position, they're exploring a possibility. They're not asking, "Are you trying to change my mind?" but "What would this mean for someone like Elena?" That shift is everything. Yet even the most moving story needs a hook, a single, unassuming word that anchors it in the listener's mind and makes its truth feel inevitable. Because once the heart is won, the final step is to ensure the message sticks, not through repetition, but through a subtle linguistic trigger that the brain cannot ignore. And sometimes, that trigger is just one word, a word so ordinary, so deeply woven into the fabric of human reasoning, that its mere presence unlocks compliance, curiosity, and quiet conviction. In a now famous social psychology experiment conducted by Ellen Langer in the 1970s, researchers tested a simple phrase at a photocopier line, "Excuse me, may I go ahead of you?" When no reason was given, only 60% of people complied. But when the request was followed by, "Because I'm in a rush," compliance jumped to 94%. The astonishing twist? When the reason was utterly meaningless, "Because I need to make copies," compliance remained just as high. The word "because" alone, even paired with a circular, redundant explanation, was enough to trigger automatic acceptance. This reveals a quiet truth about the human mind: we are not as rational as we believe. We are wired to respond not to the strength of a reason, but to the mere presence of one. The word "because" acts as a cognitive key, it signals causality, and our brains, eager to conserve mental energy, often unlock without checking whether the key fits. This is the power of the "because" trigger. It's not about logic, it's about the illusion of logic. Our minds crave narrative coherence, we want to believe our actions are grounded in cause and effect. When someone says, "We should implement this policy," the statement floats in the air, vulnerable to scrutiny. But add "because" it reduces long-term risk and protects team well-being, and suddenly the idea feels anchored, even if the reasoning is thin or assumed. The word "because" doesn't just explain, it legitimizes. It transforms a suggestion into a conclusion, a preference into a principle. And in that transformation, resistance softens. Compliance follows not because the listener has been convinced by evidence, but because their brain has registered the comforting shape of reason. This works because human cognition operates on two levels, the fast, automatic, and emotional, and the slow, deliberate, and analytical. The because trigger speaks directly to the first. It satisfies the mind's hunger for justification without demanding deep analysis. In everyday life, we use this constantly, often without realizing it. I chose this route because it's usually faster. Let's reschedule because it'll give us more time to prepare. Even when the because clause is vague or obvious, it creates a sense of intentionality that feels more trustworthy than a bare assertion. It implies thoughtfulness. It suggests that a decision wasn't arbitrary, but considered. And in a world of noise and uncertainty, that illusion of intention is profoundly reassuring. But this fragility in our rationality raises a haunting question: how much of what we call reason is actually post hoc justification? Do we truly weigh evidence before deciding, or do we decide first, based on emotion, habit, or bias, and then reach for a because to dress it in logic? The because trigger exposes the scaffolding of our self-deception. We like to believe we are captains of our choices, but often, we are passengers who invent maps after the journey has begun. This doesn't mean we are irrational, it means we are efficient. The brain seeks shortcuts, and because is one of the oldest and most trusted. Yet this power carries ethical weight. Used carelessly, the because trigger can manipulate, masking weak arguments in the costume of cause and effect. But used with integrity, it can clarify. When your because points to a genuine value, fairness, safety, growth, it doesn't deceive, it connects. It helps others see not just what you propose, but why it matters. And in that shared understanding, true alignment begins. And once that understanding is voiced, once they've spoken their reasoning aloud, you hold another key. Because now, you can gently reflect their own words back to them, revealing contradictions they may not have seen. Their language becomes the mirror in which clarity emerges, not from your correction, but from their own reflection. What you just said was, "This policy is unfair because it helps no one. Is that right?" At first glance, this seems like a simple act of clarification, a polite check for understanding. But beneath its gentle surface lies a profound psychological maneuver. The echo loop is not about parroting, it's about reflection. By repeating someone's own words back to them, verbatim or nearly so, you do something quietly transformative. You force them to hear their statement through a stranger's ears. In the echo, their passionate conviction may suddenly sound exaggerated, absolute, or even self-contradictory. And because the words are theirs, not yours, they cannot dismiss the dissonance as bias or misrepresentation. The correction, if it comes, must arise from within them. "Well, I didn't mean no one," they might say, softening the edge of their claim. And just like that, without a single rebuttal from you, the ground has shifted. This technique works because language is rarely precise in the heat of emotion. We speak in bursts of feeling, using absolutes like always, never, and everyone not as factual claims, but as emotional intensifiers. Yet the moment those words leave our lips and return to us, clean, unadorned, stripped of the internal context that gave them meaning, they often ring false, even to our own ears. The echo loop holds up a mirror made not of glass, but of their own voice. And in that reflection, they see not just what they said, but what they sounded like. This is where change begins, not through confrontation, but through self-awareness. Consider a common exchange. Someone snaps, "You never take my ideas seriously." The instinctive reply might be defensive, "That's not true, I listened last week." But this invites a counterargument about memory and evidence. Instead, try the echo loop. "So what I'm hearing is that you feel I never take your ideas seriously. Did I get that right?" Now, two things happen. First, you validate their emotional experience, they feel heard, not attacked. Second, you isolate the statement so it can be examined. In the silence that follows, they may realize the word never was too strong. Well, not never, they might concede. But lately, it's felt that way. Suddenly, the conversation has moved from accusation to nuance, from absolutes to specifics, all because you gave them the space to hear themselves. The power of the echo loop lies in its neutrality. You are not inserting your interpretation, your judgment, or your agenda. You are simply returning their words with a quiet question mark. This removes the adversarial frame. You're not the opponent, you're the witness. And people are far more willing to revise a statement when they believe the insight is their own. Cognitive psychology calls this the self-persuasion effect. We are most convinced by conclusions we reach independently. The echo loop doesn't argue, it invites. It doesn't correct, it clarifies. And in that clarity, rigid positions often soften into something more honest, more human. But this technique demands restraint. The tone must be curious, not sarcastic. The phrasing must be faithful, not distorted. If you twist their words even slightly, so you're saying this policy is useless and cruel, you've broken trust. The loop only holds when it reflects truthfully. This is not a trap, it's an offering. You're saying, here's what I heard. If it's not right, help me understand better. In doing so, you model intellectual humility while creating space for theirs. This reveals a deeper truth about human communication. We are often strangers to our own speech. In the rush to be understood, we overstate, oversimplify, and overgeneralize. The echo loop gently interrupts that cycle. It slows the conversation down, creating a moment of pause where reflection can occur. It reminds us that words have weight, and that sometimes, we throw them without realizing how they land. And in that moment of recalibration, something remarkable happens. The argument becomes a dialogue. Not because you won, but because you listened so well that the other person began to listen to themselves. And once that clarity emerges, how you deliver your next words becomes just as important as their content. Because even the most precise idea can be lost in rushed delivery, while a measured pace can lend depth to the simplest thought. The rhythm of your speech doesn't just carry your message, it shapes how it's received. Rushing equals panic. Pausing equals power. This simple equation holds more truth than we often admit. In the heat of an argument, when emotions run high and stakes feel urgent, the body's instinct is to accelerate, to speak faster, gesture more, fill every silence with words, as if speed alone could outpace doubt or overwhelm opposition. But this very haste betrays what we're trying to prove: competence, clarity, control. The confidence gap isn't about what you say, it's about how you say it. And nothing undermines authority more quietly than hurried speech. Conversely, nothing elevates it more effortlessly than deliberate slowness. When you speak quickly, especially under pressure, your voice often rises in pitch, your sentences blur together, and your thoughts seem to chase one another without resolution. To the listener, this reads not as passion, but as anxiety, a mind racing to keep up with itself. But when you slow down, when you allow a full breath between ideas, when you let a sentence land before beginning the next, you signal something entirely different. You signal that you are not reacting, you are responding. That you are not scrambling for footing, you are standing on solid ground. Slowness becomes a nonverbal assertion of mastery, not just over the topic, but over your own nervous system. It tells the other person, without a word, I am not threatened. I have time. This is especially potent when you replace filler words, like, with silence. Most people fear these gaps, believing they expose hesitation or ignorance. But in truth, silence is not emptiness, it is potential. A well-placed pause gives your listener time to absorb what you've said, and it gives you time to choose your next words with precision. More importantly, it reframes the silence itself. Instead of signaling uncertainty, it becomes a vessel for gravitas. Think of the most compelling speakers you've encountered, not the loudest or fastest, but those who spoke with unhurried certainty, whose pauses felt intentional, whose words seemed carved rather than spilled. Their power came not from volume, but from rhythm. Neurologically, slower speech activates different responses in the listener's brain. Rapid talk can trigger mild stress, activating the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, while measured pacing engages the prefrontal cortex, associated with reasoning and trust. You're not just communicating ideas, you're regulating the emotional climate of the conversation. In doing so, you create space for your points to be heard, not just endured. Yet this runs counter to everything modern life teaches us. We live in an age of instant replies, rapid-fire debates, and soundbite wisdom. Speed is glorified as efficiency, as intelligence, as relevance. To speak slowly is to risk being labeled dull, indecisive, or out of touch. But this is the illusion of haste. True intelligence isn't measured in words per minute, but in depth per thought. And in argument, where the goal is not to dominate, but to persuade, depth always outlasts speed. Slowness, then, is not passivity. It is rebellion. It is a quiet refusal to be swept into the current of reactivity. It is the choice to inhabit time fully, rather than flee through it. This rebellion wins because it disrupts expectation. In a world where everyone is shouting to be heard, the person who speaks with calm deliberation commands attention not through force, but through contrast. Their words carry more weight because they are fewer, chosen, and spaced with care. They appear not just confident, but composed, someone who has considered the issue from all angles and arrived at clarity, not just conviction. But mastering this requires more than technique, it demands inner stillness. You cannot fake slowness without presence. If your mind is racing while your mouth moves slowly, the dissonance will show, in your eyes, your breath, the tension in your jaw. True slowness flows from a place of centeredness. It is the outer expression of inner quiet. And that quiet is contagious. It invites the other person to lower their guard, to breathe, to think. And sometimes, the most powerful use of that calm isn't to press your advantage, but to let the other person believe they've won. Because in the theater of human interaction, victory is not always about being right. Sometimes, it's about allowing the other person to save face, to feel heard, to walk away believing they've influenced you, while you've gently steered the outcome toward your shared truth. This is the art of strategic surrender, letting them feel victorious, so that the real victory, understanding, alignment, resolution, can quietly take root. You're absolutely right that this system is broken. And that's exactly why we need to try something new. At first glance, this sounds like concession. But look closer, it's alchemy. The agree and redirect play is one of the most elegant maneuvers in the art of persuasive dialogue, not because it defeats the other person, but because it dissolves the very notion of opposition. Instead of meeting resistance with counterforce, you meet it with acknowledgement. You validate their core concern, the emotional truth beneath their argument, without necessarily endorsing their proposed solution. In doing so, you disarm the armor of defensiveness that so often turns discussion into combat. And once that armor falls, you gently pivot, given that, wouldn't it make sense to consider? Suddenly, they're not being pushed toward your view, they're being invited to explore it as a natural extension of their own. This technique works because human beings rarely argue about facts alone. We argue about values, fears, and unmet needs disguised as opinions. When someone insists, "This policy is disastrous," they're often really saying, "I'm afraid we're moving in the wrong direction," or "I feel unheard in this process." If you respond by attacking their conclusion, you're wrong, the data proves it works. You ignore the real issue and trigger resistance. But if you say, "I share your concern about unintended consequences, this is too important to get wrong," you honor the heart of their worry. You create common ground. And from that shared space, redirection becomes collaboration, not coercion. The magic lies in the pivot. It must feel organic, not abrupt. It should flow so naturally from the agreement that the other person doesn't feel steered, but led. You're right, waiting 6 months for a response is unacceptable. That's why I propose we streamline the process starting next week. Notice how the solution emerges not as a rebuttal, but as a consequence of the shared concern. The frame has shifted, but the other person hasn't been shoved into it. They've walked in willingly, believing the door was always open. This approach demands emotional intelligence and restraint. It requires you to separate the person's underlying need from their surface-level demand. It asks you to set aside the ego-driven urge to be right, to win, to prove your superiority. And that is where its deeper wisdom resides. Winning an argument is not about domination. It's about alignment. And alignment begins not with assertion, but with surrender, not of your principles, but of your need to be seen as correct in every moment. True influence flows not from the top down, but from side by side. When you let someone feel heard, you don't lose ground, you expand the field on which you both stand. Of course, this is not about empty flattery or false agreement. If you say you're right when you genuinely believe they're wrong, the dissonance will leak through your tone, your eyes, your posture. Authenticity is non-negotiable. The agreement must be real, even if it's only partial. You might not agree with their diagnosis, but you can agree with their desire for fairness, safety, or dignity. Find that sliver of shared humanity, and build your bridge from there. Historically, the greatest negotiators, diplomats, and peacemakers have mastered this art. Nelson Mandela didn't begin by condemning his opponents, he acknowledged their fears before inviting them into a new vision. In everyday life, too, this play transforms tense conversations into opportunities for connection. A parent tells a teenager, "You're right, being grounded every weekend does feel like punishment without purpose. So let's design a consequence that actually helps you learn." The teen, expecting a battle, finds an ally, and is far more likely to engage. But the agree and redirect play only works if it's rooted in genuine understanding. You cannot redirect someone you haven't first sought to comprehend. Agreement without empathy rings hollow. So before you pivot, before you propose, before you even formulate your response, listen. Not to reply, but to understand. Because true redirection begins not with words, but with the quiet act of seeing the other person clearly, in all their complexity, fear, and hope. And that begins with empathy, not as a tactic, but as a foundation. People don't care how much you know, until they know how much you care. This old adage, often dismissed as sentimental, is in fact one of the most potent truths in human communication. In the midst of disagreement, especially when emotions run high, the first barrier to resolution isn't logic, evidence, or even principle. It's the simple, primal need to feel seen. When someone believes they are misunderstood, dismissed, or judged, their brain registers a threat. Cortisol floods their system, the amygdala flares, and the doors to reason slam shut. No amount of data, no perfectly structured argument, will get through. But empathy, genuine, unhurried empathy, acts like a key. It doesn't argue with the lock, it simply turns it open. The empathy setup begins not with your point, but with their pain. It starts with a phrase like, "I can see why you'd feel that way. If I were in your position, I might too." Notice what this does. It doesn't say, "You're right." It doesn't concede ground. It simply acknowledges the emotional logic behind their stance. And in that acknowledgement, something remarkable happens. Their nervous system begins to relax. The threat response eases. Neural pathways associated with social connection and higher reasoning, long suppressed by defensiveness, start to reactivate. Trust, fragile and flickering, begins to form. Only then, only after this psychological space has been cleared, does your perspective have a chance to land. This is not manipulation. It is human architecture. We are wired for connection before cognition. Long before our ancestors debated philosophy or policy, they needed to know, are you friend or foe? That question still echoes in every conversation. When you lead with empathy, you answer it clearly, I am not your enemy. You signal safety. And in that safety, minds become malleable, not because they've been overpowered, but because they've been honored. Consider a workplace conflict. A team member snaps. You never consider how your deadlines affect the rest of us. The reactive response might be, I do. You just don't see it. But that only escalates. Instead, try, it sounds like you've been carrying a lot of pressure, and my timelines have made it worse. That must be incredibly frustrating. In that moment, you've done three things. You've named their emotion, you've taken partial ownership of the impact, not the intent, and you've validated their experience as real. Their shoulders drop. Their voice softens. And now, when you say, I'd like to understand how we can adjust this together, they're listening, not with suspicion, but with openness. But empathy must be authentic. If your tone is patronizing, your words rehearsed, or your eyes darting away, the setup collapses. True empathy requires presence, the willingness to momentarily set aside your own narrative and step into theirs, not to fix, but to witness. It's not about agreeing with their conclusions, it's about honoring the journey that led them there. And paradoxically, this act of humility becomes your greatest strength. Because once someone feels understood, they no longer need to fight for recognition. Their energy shifts from defense to dialogue. This reveals a profound truth: empathy is not weakness. It is the ultimate strategic advantage. In war, the most effective negotiators are those who understand their adversary's fears and motivations. In medicine, doctors who express empathy see better patient compliance and outcomes. In leadership, teams thrive under those who listen before they lead. Empathy disarms not by surrendering, but by dissolving the illusion of separation. It transforms us versus them into we. And in that shift, enemies become collaborators, not because they've been defeated, but because they've been seen. Yet even the deepest empathy has its limits. There are moments when continued engagement only fuels toxicity, when presence becomes complicity, or when the other person is not ready, or willing, to meet you in that shared space. In those cases, the wisest move is not to push harder, but to step back. Because sometimes, the most powerful act of care and control is to walk away. Not in anger, not in defeat, but with quiet intention, leaving the door open for a future conversation that can truly begin. The person who ends the conversation controls its echo. This quiet truth is often overlooked in the heat of disagreement, where we assume that staying until the last word is spoken equals strength. But real influence isn't always measured in volume or endurance, it's measured in resonance. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do in a spiraling argument is not to stay and fight, but to leave with calm intention. The exit advantage isn't about fleeing conflict, it's about mastering its aftermath. By choosing when to disengage, you deny the other person the emotional payoff of your frustration, and you ensure that your final words, not theirs, linger in the silence that follows. Imagine an argument escalating, voices rising, points growing sharper, logic giving way to accusation. The air thickens with tension. In that moment, instinct urges you to hold your ground, to prove your point, to not let them get the last word. But consider the alternative. Take a slow breath. Soften your tone. Say, with genuine composure, I want to think about what you've said. Let's pause here. Then walk away, not abruptly, not angrily, but with the quiet dignity of someone who values clarity over victory. In doing so, you accomplish several things at once. You refuse to participate in the emotional freefall. You model self-regulation. And most importantly, you plant your last statement as the seed that will grow in their mind long after you're gone. Psychologically, The final impression of any interaction carries disproportionate weight, a phenomenon known as the recency effect. If the last thing they hear is you shouting, "You never listen," that's the lens through which they'll replay the entire exchange. But if the last thing they hear is, "I care about getting this right," or "I need a moment to reflect so I can respond thoughtfully," that becomes the emotional anchor. Your calm exit reframes the entire conflict, not as a battle, but as a shared problem temporarily set aside. And because you left without hostility, without slamming doors or cutting ties, the other person is far more likely to revisit the issue later, not with defensiveness, but with curiosity. Often, they'll return to you days later with a softened stance, a new insight, or even an apology. Not because you won in the moment, but because you planted a flag in the future. This is not passive withdrawal. It is strategic presence. Walking away requires more courage than staying, because it means relinquishing the immediate gratification of being heard right now. It demands trust, in time, in the other person's capacity for reflection, and in your own integrity. You must believe that your truth doesn't need to be defended in real time to endure. And in that trust lies power. You shift the battlefield from the volatile present to the reflective future, where reason has a chance to catch up with emotion. Of course, the exit advantage only works when it's done with sincerity, not as a manipulative ploy. If your departure feels like punishment, fine, I'm done talking to you. It will breed resentment, not reflection. But if it's framed as care, I don't want to say something I'll regret. Can we continue this when we're both calm? It becomes an act of respect, for both yourself and the other person. It signals that the relationship matters more than the argument. This approach also honors a deeper truth about human change: it rarely happens in the storm. Insight blooms in stillness. By creating space, you give the other person room to breathe, to question, to reconsider, without the pressure of your presence demanding an immediate response. And in that space, your perspective may take root not because you forced it, but because they invited it in on their own. Walking away, then, is not retreat. It is a quiet declaration that you are playing a longer game, one measured not in moments of triumph, but in the slow unfolding of understanding. It is planting a flag not in the soil of the present conflict, but in the fertile ground of what might yet be. And when that future conversation begins, when they return, ready to engage anew, the terms of the dialogue will have shifted. Not by force, but by framing. Because how you define the issue, how you name the problem, ultimately decides not just the direction of the discussion, but who holds the power within it. The frame is the lens through which everything is seen, and the one who sets it often wins without ever raising their voice. Is it a cost, or an investment? A risk, or an opportunity? The same reality, viewed through two different lenses, can inspire dread or hope, resistance or action. This is the essence of the framing shift, the subtle but seismic act of redefining the terms of an argument so thoroughly that your position becomes not just defensible, but inevitable. Because arguments are rarely won on facts alone. They are won in the frame. Facts are static, frames are dynamic. And the person who controls the frame controls the narrative, the emotions, and ultimately, the outcome. Consider a debate about a new workplace policy. One side asks, why should we spend so much money on this? Framing it as an unnecessary expense. The other side could respond by defending the price tag, listing benefits, comparing vendors. But that keeps them trapped in the opponent's frame. This is a cost to be justified. Instead, the framing shift offers a different question: what's the cost of not doing this? Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about spending, it's about loss. Lost productivity. Lost morale. Lost talent. The same policy is now seen not as a drain, but as protection. You've moved from defense to vision. You're no longer explaining why you're right, you're inviting the other person to see the world as you do. This works because the human mind doesn't process reality directly, it processes interpretations. Raw data is neutral. It's the story we wrap around it that gives it meaning. A rainy day is a nuisance to a commuter, a blessing to a farmer, a mood to a poet. In argument, the same principle applies. The policy isn't inherently expensive or wise, it becomes one or the other based on the frame through which it's viewed. By shifting that frame, you don't change the facts, you change their emotional and moral weight. The power of framing lies in its invisibility. Most people don't notice the lens, they only see the image it produces. That's why political campaigns don't debate tax rates, they debate fairness or freedom. Environmentalists don't talk about parts per million of CO2, they talk about our children's future. These aren't evasions, they're strategic reorientations that tap into deeper values. When you reframe an issue around shared principles, safety, dignity, legacy, you bypass resistance and speak directly to what truly motivates people. But mastering the framing shift requires more than clever wording. It demands empathy and insight. You must understand not just your own position, but the fears and values driving the other side. Only then can you craft a frame that resonates rather than repels. For instance, instead of arguing for stricter data privacy laws as government overreach, reframe them as protecting your family's digital life. The policy hasn't changed, but the emotional context has. Now it's not about bureaucracy, it's about care. This reveals a profound truth: reality is neutral. Meaning is manufactured. Two people can witness the same event and walk away with opposite conclusions, not because one is lying, but because each has framed it through their own history, beliefs, and needs. To master framing is not to distort truth, but to illuminate it in a light others can see. It is the art of making the invisible stakes visible, of showing not just what something is, but what it means. And yet, framing alone is not enough. Because meaning doesn't live only in the realm of ideas, it lives in the body. A well-framed argument may convince the mind, but if it doesn't stir the heart, if it doesn't create a visceral shift in how someone feels about the issue, it will remain abstract, distant, forgettable. True persuasion happens when the frame is not just understood, but felt, when the listener's breath catches, their posture shifts, their eyes widen with recognition. Because perception isn't just cognitive. It's embodied. And to move someone deeply, you must speak not only to their thoughts, but to their nervous system, to the place where logic ends and emotion begins. Logic makes people think. Emotion makes them act. This is not a flaw in human nature, it is its design. For all our pride and reason, the truth is that we are moved not by data points, but by stories that stir the heart, not by statistics, but by images that haunt the imagination. The emotion switch is the deliberate act of shifting a conversation from the cool terrain of analysis into the warm, urgent landscape of feeling. It doesn't discard logic, it escorts it through the gate that emotion unlocks. Because no matter how sound your argument, if it remains abstract, distant, or theoretical, it will float in the mind like a ghost, seen, but never held. The switch is thrown with vivid language. Not this policy affects vulnerable populations, but imagine your child standing in that line tomorrow, cold and hungry, because the shelter turned them away. In that moment, the issue ceases to be a political debate or a budget line. It becomes personal. It becomes possible. The listener's body responds before their mind can object, their chest tightens, their breath slows, their posture shifts. This is not manipulation in the pejorative sense, it is translation. You are rendering an invisible truth into sensory experience, making the intangible tangible. And in that visceral shift, resistance softens. Urgency awakens. The brain's emotional centers, the amygdala, the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, light up, creating a neurochemical cascade that prioritizes the issue as important, not just interesting. This works because the human nervous system evolved to respond to immediate, concrete threats, not abstract probabilities. Telling someone there's a 30% chance of systemic collapse registers as noise. But describing the grocery shelves empty, the lights flickering out, the silence where a neighbor's laughter used to be, that lands in the gut. Emotion bypasses the gatekeepers of skepticism because it speaks the oldest language we know: survival, care, belonging. When you activate that language, you don't override reason, you prepare the soil for it to take root. But this power carries a profound ethical weight. Emotion without integrity is exploitation. Fearmongering, guilt-tripping, or manufactured outrage may produce short-term compliance, but they erode trust and breed resentment. The emotion switch must be wielded not to control, but to connect, not to frighten, but to awaken shared humanity. Ask yourself, does this feeling serve a truth larger than my ego? Am I evoking emotion to illuminate a real consequence, or to mask a weak argument? The difference lies in intent. When your cause is just, when you speak of real suffering, real hope, real stakes, then evoking emotion is not only ethical, it is necessary. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is complicity. And sometimes, the only way to break through numbness is to make someone feel the weight of what's at stake. Consider the civil rights movement. It wasn't spreadsheets on inequality that changed laws, it was photographs of fire hoses turned on children, speeches that painted dreams in technicolor, songs that carried grief and resolve in every note. These didn't replace logic, they gave it a body. They made the abstract agony of segregation impossible to ignore because it was no longer abstract, it was in the eyes of a young girl walking to school, flanked by federal marshals. That is the emotion switch at its highest purpose, not to provoke, but to reveal. And yet, even the most vivid imagery gains its deepest resonance when it is personalized. A child in need moves us, but your child? That strikes the core. Which is why the most potent emotional lever is often the simplest: a name. Not just any name, but the listener's own. Because few words carry more emotional weight, more primal recognition, than the sound of one's own name spoken with care. It cuts through noise. It signals, this is about you. And in that moment of personal address, the heart opens just a little wider, ready to receive what comes next. Hearing your name activates the brain's reward center. It's primal. Personal. Before you even process the words that follow, your nervous system responds, subtly, instantly, as if a hand has gently touched your shoulder in a crowded room. In a world saturated with noise, algorithms, and faceless interactions, the sound of your own name cuts through the static like a single clear note in a symphony of chaos. It signals, you are seen. You are not just a voice in the argument, you are a person. This is the quiet power of the name shortcut, not a trick, but a bridge. A single word that, when spoken with sincerity, can lower the walls of defensiveness faster than any logic or plea. Consider the difference between "I understand your concern" and "Sarah, I understand your concern." The first is a general acknowledgement, the second is a direct address. It lands not in the abstract space of debate, but in the intimate chamber of identity. Neuroscience confirms this. Studies using fMRI scans show that hearing one's own name triggers activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with self-referential thought, social cognition, and emotional regulation. It's not vanity, it's biology. From infancy, we are conditioned to respond to our name as a signal of safety, attention, and connection. Even in adulthood, that wiring remains. When someone uses your name with care, especially intention, it momentarily overrides the brain's threat response. The amygdala quiets. The heart rate steadies. For a fleeting second, you are no longer an adversary, you are a human being, recognized. But this power must be handled with reverence. The name shortcut loses its magic if overused or deployed mechanically. Saying someone's name 3 times in a minute feels like a sales tactic, not a gesture of respect. Its potency lies in scarcity and intention. Use it sparingly, at the very beginning of a difficult conversation to establish presence, or just before delivering a key point to ensure it lands in the soil of personal connection. James, what you're describing matters deeply. In that moment, you're not just addressing his words, you're honoring his experience. You signal that this isn't a transactional exchange, but a dialogue between 2 people who matter. This is especially vital in conflict, where arguments often reduce individuals to positions. You're the one who wants to cut funding, becomes a label, not a person. But when you say, Elena, I know you're advocating for this because you've seen how it impacts real families, you restore her humanity. You separate the stance from the self. And in that separation, space opens for nuance, for listening, for change. The name becomes an anchor, not to control, but to reconnect. This reveals a deeper truth about modern life. We are drowning in anonymity. We scroll past thousands of faces, exchange messages with avatars, argue with usernames. In such a landscape, being named is a rare and sacred act. It says, I took the time to learn who you are. I'm not speaking to a role, a title, or an opinion, I'm speaking to you. And in that recognition, something profound happens. The listener feels safe. Not because they've won, but because they've been seen. Safety is not the absence of disagreement, it's the presence of respect. And when people feel safe, they stop defending and start exploring. Of course, this only works when the name is spoken with warmth, not weaponized with sarcasm or condescension. Tone is everything. A softly spoken Michael can disarm, a sharp Michael can escalate. The intention behind the word must be genuine, rooted in curiosity, not calculation. When it is, the name becomes more than a label, it becomes an invitation. And in that atmosphere of safety, where the other person feels known, not judged, agreement becomes possible. Not through force, but through trust. Because once someone feels secure enough to lower their guard, they become open to small points of alignment. A nod. That's fair. A quiet I hadn't thought of it that way. These are the seeds of consensus. And from those tiny affirmations, larger agreements can grow, one small yes at a time. Start with truths they can't deny. We both want what's best, right? You care about fairness, don't you? These aren't rhetorical flourishes, they are the first rungs on a subtle psychological ladder. The yes ladder is the art of guiding someone toward a significant agreement by first inviting them to say yes to a series of small, undeniable truths. Each affirmation, however minor, builds momentum. It creates a rhythm of alignment, a psychological current that gently pulls the conversation forward. And by the time you reach your larger point, their own mind, eager to avoid the discomfort of inconsistency, often says yes not because it's been convinced by logic, but because it seeks harmony with everything it has already affirmed. This technique works because human beings are deeply wired for consistency. Once we commit to an idea, even a trivial one, we experience internal pressure to align future choices with that initial stance. Psychologists call this cognitive consistency, and its violation produces cognitive dissonance, that uneasy feeling when our actions contradict our beliefs. To avoid this discomfort, we often adjust our views to match our prior statements. So when someone has already agreed that children's safety matters, that resources should be used wisely, and that long-term thinking is important, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to reject a proposal that embodies all three, even if they might have opposed it in isolation. Their yes to the small truths has already paved the road to the larger one. The elegance of the yes ladder lies in its gentleness. It doesn't confront, it invites. It doesn't demand, it suggests. Each question is framed not as a challenge, but as a shared assumption. You wouldn't want anyone to feel excluded, would you? It makes sense to consider all options before deciding, doesn't it? These aren't traps, they're mirrors reflecting values the other person likely already holds. And because the questions are rooted in universal principles, fairness, care, prudence, they feel natural to affirm. The listener isn't being manipulated, they're being reminded of who they believe themselves to be. But this raises a quiet ethical question: is it right to use psychological consistency as a pathway to persuasion? After all, consistency can be a cage we build for ourselves, one that keeps us from changing our minds, even when new evidence demands it. If someone says yes to your final proposal only to avoid the discomfort of contradiction, have they truly agreed, or merely surrendered to internal pressure? The answer depends on intent. If the destination serves truth, justice, or mutual well-being, if your larger point is genuinely aligned with the values you've evoked, then the yes ladder is not deception, but facilitation. You're not manufacturing consent, you're helping someone reconnect with their own principles. But if the ladder leads to a place that betrays those values, then it becomes coercion disguised as consensus. Consider a real-world example. A manager wants to implement a new feedback system that some team members resist. Instead of arguing its merits outright, they begin, "We all want this team to grow, right? You believe honest communication helps us improve, don't you? And you'd agree that feedback should be constructive, not critical?" Each question draws a yes. By the time they introduce the new system as a tool that embodies all three ideals, resistance softens. Not because the team was outmaneuvered, but because they recognized their own values in the proposal. The yes ladder also honors a deeper truth about human change: it rarely happens in leaps. It unfolds in steps. Big shifts feel safer when preceded by small confirmations. Each yes is a foothold, a moment of trust that makes the next step feel less like a risk and more like a continuation. And in that gradual ascent, opposition transforms into ownership. Yet even the most carefully constructed ladder needs contrast to appear reasonable. A proposal may seem radical in isolation, but place it beside something more extreme, and it suddenly looks moderate, even prudent. This is the next layer of influence, not just building agreement, but shaping perception through comparison. Because to make your position acceptable, sometimes you must first make another option seem unthinkable. A $100 shirt seems cheap, next to a $1,000 one. This isn't just clever pricing, it's a fundamental truth about human perception. We don't judge things in isolation. We judge them in relation to what we've just seen, heard, or imagined. This is the anchoring play, the strategic introduction of a more extreme, less palatable alternative before presenting your actual proposal. By doing so, you shift the frame of reference. Your position, once potentially controversial or demanding, now appears reasonable, even generous, simply because it's not the alternative. Some say we should ban this entirely, you might say. I think a balanced approach is better. In that moment, your moderate stance doesn't just stand on its own merits, it shines by contrast. This technique exploits a well-documented cognitive bias known as anchoring, first identified by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. When people are asked to make judgments about value, fairness, risk, they latch onto the first piece of information they receive, the anchor, and adjust their thinking from there, even if the anchor is arbitrary. In negotiations, the initial offer sets the tone for everything that follows. In moral debates, the first option presented shapes what feels acceptable. The anchoring play harnesses this instinct deliberately. You don't argue that your idea is perfect, you ensure it looks like the best among visible choices. The power lies not in deception, but in context. Consider a community meeting about school funding. If you propose a 10% tax increase outright, you may meet resistance. But if you begin by acknowledging, there are voices calling for a complete overhaul, doubling funding overnight, which would require a 20% hike, and then offer your 10% plan as a measured, sustainable step, suddenly your proposal feels prudent, even cautious. You haven't changed the numbers, you've changed the story around them. The mind, seeking a safe harbor between extremes, gravitates toward the middle. And by placing your idea there, you make compromise feel like wisdom. This works because human judgment is inherently relative. We have no internal scale for fair or expensive or risky, only comparisons. A 2-hour delay feels unbearable after a promise of on-time arrival, but acceptable if the alternative was a canceled flight. A policy feels draconian until you hear the version that strips away all protections. The anchoring play doesn't fabricate these extremes. Often, they already exist in the discourse. Your role is simply to name them first, so your solution becomes the relief, not the demand. But this approach carries ethical nuance. If the worst alternative is a straw man, exaggerated, misrepresented, or invented solely to make your position look better, then the anchor becomes a distortion, not a reference point. The ethical wielder of this play uses real, credible alternatives, even if they're fringe. They don't invent monsters, they acknowledge shadows that already exist in the conversation. In doing so, they don't manipulate perception, they clarify it. They help others see that your proposal isn't radical, it's a refuge from something genuinely more extreme. Moreover, the anchoring play reveals a deeper truth about reality itself. It is neutral, but our experience of it is sculpted by contrast. Light is only visible against darkness. Calm is felt after chaos. Generosity is recognized beside greed. To master anchoring is not to lie about the world, but to guide attention toward the comparisons that reveal your point in its truest light. It is the art of making the reasonable feel inevitable, not by shouting, but by showing what lies on the other side of the spectrum. And yet, even the most perfectly anchored idea can fall flat if it's poorly placed within your message. Because persuasion isn't just about what you say or how you frame it, it's about where you put it. The human mind remembers beginnings and endings most vividly. A point buried in the middle drowns in noise. But a point placed with intention, sandwiched between truths, nestled in a narrative arc, or delivered at the moment of greatest openness, can echo long after the conversation ends. Structure, then, is silent rhetoric. And the most compelling messages are not just well-framed, but well-placed. People accept controversial ideas, when wrapped in consensus. This is not a flaw in human reasoning, it is its quiet architecture. We are not purely logical creatures weighing evidence in a vacuum, we are social beings seeking coherence within a web of shared understanding. The truth sandwich leverages this instinct by embedding your most contentious point between two widely accepted facts, transforming it from an isolated opinion into a necessary link in a chain of reason. Structure it like this: fact your point, fact. Studies show collaboration boosts morale. That's why this policy, while tough, is necessary. And data confirms teams adapt within 30 days. In this sequence, your argument ceases to feel like an imposition, it becomes the logical bridge between two truths the listener already trusts. The brilliance of this method lies in its subtlety. You're not asking the other person to leap into uncertainty, you're inviting them to walk across a bridge you've anchored firmly on both sides in solid ground. The first fact establishes common ground, something undeniable, preferably backed by data, tradition, or shared experience. The second fact offers reassurance, a promise of resolution, a timeline, a safety net. Your point, nestled between them, no longer stands alone as a vulnerable assertion. It becomes the connective tissue, the therefore that the mind almost supplies on its own. The listener doesn't feel persuaded, they feel they've arrived. And that sense of self-discovery is far more durable than any externally imposed conclusion. This works because the human brain craves narrative coherence. We don't just collect facts, we weave them into stories that make sense of the world. When your controversial idea appears as the natural consequence of two accepted truths, it slots seamlessly into that story. Resistance softens because the mind perceives continuity, not contradiction. Consider a manager introducing a difficult restructuring. Employee well-being is our top priority, that's why we're making these changes now. And past transitions show that clarity, even when uncomfortable, leads to stronger teams within weeks. The painful decision is no longer framed as a cost-cutting measure, but as an act of care, bookended by commitments the team already believes in. But the truth sandwich only holds if the bread is genuine. If the surrounding facts are flimsy, exaggerated, or ideologically charged, the entire structure collapses under scrutiny. Authenticity is essential. The outer layers must be truths the listener already accepts, not just truths you believe, but truths they feel. This requires deep listening. You must know not only what is objectively true, but what resonates as true for the other person. Only then can you build a sandwich that nourishes rather than chokes. This reveals a profound insight. Truth isn't just content, it's context. A statement, no matter how accurate, can feel alien or threatening if dropped into the wrong emotional or intellectual environment. But place that same statement between two familiar ideas, and it becomes not just acceptable, but inevitable. Context is architecture. It doesn't change the bricks of truth, but it determines whether they form a fortress or a home. The truth sandwich is the art of building a home for your idea, one where the listener feels safe enough to walk inside and stay a while. And yet, even the most artfully constructed home can feel foreign if the guest believes it was built for someone else. The most elegant form of persuasion, then, isn't just making your idea palatable, it's making the other person believe it was theirs all along. Because when someone defends an idea as their own, they invest in it emotionally, intellectually, and morally. They become its champion, not its critic. And the most graceful way to achieve this isn't through argument, but through invitation, by asking questions that guide them to articulate your conclusion as their own insight. In that moment, persuasion disappears. All that remains is shared discovery. Ask, how would you solve this? Then listen, not to rebut, but to guide. This simple question is the opening note of the ego hook, one of the most elegant maneuvers in the art of influence. It works not by asserting your position, but by inviting the other person to construct it themselves. People fiercely defend ideas they believe are their own. They invest in them emotionally, refine them intellectually, and champion them socially. The ego hook harnesses this deep human impulse, not to deceive, but to collaborate in disguise. By asking open-ended questions that gently steer their reasoning, you help them discover your conclusion as if it were their own insight. And in that moment of self-generated clarity, their ego, often the greatest barrier to persuasion, becomes your quietest ally. This technique thrives on the sacred human need for autonomy. We resist being told what to think, but we embrace what we believe we've figured out. The difference isn't in the idea, it's in its origin story. If you declare, we should implement this new system, you trigger evaluation, skepticism, even opposition. But if you ask, what kind of system would ensure both efficiency and fairness here, and then reflect, refine, and gently expand on their response, so if we prioritize transparency and speed, something like X might align with that. You've handed them the blueprint while letting them hold the pen. They don't feel led, they feel brilliant. And once an idea lives in their mind as their own creation, they will defend it with a passion no external argument could ever inspire. The ego hook is not manipulation in the cynical sense. It does not fabricate false choices or trap the unwary. Instead, it creates a space where the other person's values, intelligence, and experience can converge with your intended outcome. It requires deep listening, patience, and restraint. You must suppress the urge to interrupt, correct, or rush. Instead, you mirror their language, honor their concerns, and pose follow-up questions that nudge them toward the logical conclusion you already see. If that's your priority, how would you address the risk of delay? Given what you've said about equity, what safeguards would you build in? Each question is a quiet hand on the rudder, turning the ship without the passenger noticing the change in course. This reveals a haunting truth about human freedom. Autonomy is often an illusion we cherish more than the reality. We like to believe we act from pure, independent will, but our choices are shaped by framing, sequence, language, and context. The ego hook doesn't strip away that illusion, it honors it. It gives the other person the feeling of choice, the dignity of authorship, while guiding the narrative toward a shared destination. And because that feeling is so deeply satisfying, they walk the path not with reluctance, but with ownership. They don't comply, they commit. Consider a parent trying to encourage responsibility in a teenager. Instead of dictating, "You need to manage your own homework schedule," they ask, "What do you think would help you stay on top of assignments without last-minute stress?" The teen might suggest a planner, phone reminders, or a study buddy. The parent then supports that idea, perhaps adding, "And if you set it up yourself, you have full control over how it works, no nagging from me." The solution is now the teens. They'll defend it, refine it, and stick with it, not because they were told to, but because it emerged from their own mind. But this approach demands integrity. If your questions are leading in bad faith, if you're merely dressing up coercion as curiosity, the dissonance will be felt. The ego hook only works when your goal aligns with their genuine well-being or shared values. When it does, it becomes not a tactic, but a form of respect. You trust them enough to let them arrive at the truth on their own terms. And yet, even the most skillfully guided conversation sometimes reaches a point where words are no longer needed. Because after you've asked the right question, after you've given them space to think, the most powerful move may be to say nothing at all. Silence, in that moment, becomes the final invitation, an open field where their own mind does the work of persuasion. Sometimes, the deepest influence isn't spoken. It's held in the quiet. After a bold statement, stay silent. Watch them unravel their own certainty. This is not passive withdrawal, it is active presence. The silence weapon is one of the most potent yet underused tools in the art of psychological influence, not because it adds anything, but because it subtracts everything: noise, reaction, distraction. In the space you leave empty, the other person's mind rushes to fill the void. And in that rush, certainty often cracks, contradictions surface, and defenses collapse, not because you attacked them, but because you gave them room to confront themselves. Silence creates cognitive tension. Human beings are wired for resolution. Unresolved pauses feel like open circuits in the brain. When you make a clear, calm statement, that approach overlooks the long-term consequences, or "I can't support this unless we address the ethical concerns," and then say nothing more. You deny the other person the expected script. They anticipate rebuttal, defensiveness, escalation. Instead, they meet stillness. That dissonance triggers a quiet panic. To relieve the discomfort of the unresolved, they begin to talk, often too much. They over-explain, backtrack, qualify, or even contradict their earlier position, all in an unconscious attempt to restore equilibrium. Your silence becomes a mirror, and in its reflective surface, they see not just their words, but the instability beneath them. This technique works because dialogue is rarely just an exchange of ideas, it's a dance of validation. We speak not only to convey, but to be met. When that meeting doesn't come, the mind spirals inward. Did they not hear me? Do they disagree? Am I wrong? These questions, unspoken but urgent, force self-scrutiny. And in that introspection, truth often emerges, not from your argument, but from their own reckoning. A manager might insist a project is on track, but when met with quiet after stating, "The client hasn't signed off in 3 weeks," they may add, "Well, maybe we should reassess our timeline." The concession comes not from pressure, but from the echo of their own voice in the silence you provided. But the silence weapon must be wielded with composure, not coldness. If your silence feels like judgment, dismissal, or punishment, it will harden rather than soften the other person. The key lies in your presence. Maintain soft eye contact, keep your posture open, breathe evenly. Your silence should feel like an invitation, not a wall. It says, "I've said my piece. I'm listening. Take the space you need." This transforms silence from a void into a container, a sacred pause where reflection can occur. This reveals a haunting truth about the human mind. In the absence of external noise, we hear our own echoes most clearly. And sometimes, those echoes are lies we've told ourselves to feel safe, right, or in control. Silence strips away the performance. Without an audience to convince, the internal narrative falters. We see the gaps, the exaggerations, the fears masquerading as facts. In that vulnerability, growth becomes possible, not because someone won the argument, but because the truth finally had room to breathe. Of course, this power demands restraint. The urge to fill the silence, to clarify, to soften, to reassure, is strong, especially for those who value harmony. But true influence often lies in the discipline of non-action. You must trust that your words, once spoken with clarity, carry their own weight. You do not need to prop them up with repetition or justification. Let them stand. Let them settle. Let the other person sit with them. And when the silence has done its work, when the other person has spoken, stumbled, or softened, that is the moment to speak again. Not to gloat, not to press, but to offer a final thought so clear, so resonant, that it lingers long after the conversation ends. Because the last word, delivered after thoughtful silence, carries the weight of everything unsaid. And when you do speak at the end, make it unforgettable. What kind of world do we want to build, lingers longer than any fact? It doesn't argue. It doesn't accuse. It simply opens a door in the mind and invites the listener to step through, not with logic, but with longing. This is the essence of the final frame, to close a conversation not with a declaration, but with a question so resonant, so rooted in shared humanity, that it bypasses the walls of debate and lands directly in the heart. While facts fade and positions harden, certain questions echo in the quiet hours, returning again and again like a tide that slowly reshapes the shore. If not now, when? What would you tell your younger self about this? Who do we become if we choose convenience over courage? These are not queries seeking answers, they are mirrors disguised as words, reflecting back the listener's deepest values, fears, and hopes. The power of the final frame lies in its refusal to conclude. Most arguments end with a period, a full stop that invites closure, often leaving one side victorious and the other defeated. But a well-crafted final question ends with an ellipsis, an open space that the mind cannot ignore. It transforms the conversation from a battle to be won into a reflection to be lived. Instead of walking away with a rehearsed rebuttal, the other person carries the question with them, into their commute, their dinner, their dreams. And in that private space, where ego softens and honesty rises, the question does its work. It doesn't demand agreement, it cultivates contemplation. And contemplation, given time, often ripens into change. This technique works because it shifts the terrain from the external to the internal. Debates happen in the arena of facts and opinions, but transformation occurs in the sanctuary of personal meaning. A question like "what legacy are we creating with this decision?" doesn't challenge someone's logic, it appeals to their identity. It asks them to see themselves not as a debater, but as a parent, a leader, a citizen, a human being standing at a crossroads. In that reframing, resistance loses its grip. The mind may argue with data, but the soul rarely argues with purpose. Consider a conversation about climate policy. You could list statistics, cite experts, and outline consequences, but those details will blur in memory. Instead, end with, "When your grandchildren ask what you did when you knew, What will you say? That question doesn't live in the prefrontal cortex, it settles in the chest. It bypasses political affiliation and speaks to something older, quieter, more enduring, the desire to be worthy of love, to be remembered with pride, to have acted when it mattered. That is the alchemy of the final frame. It turns abstract stakes into intimate responsibility. But this approach demands sincerity. A manipulative or rhetorical question, "Oh, so you're fine with destroying the planet?" will trigger defensiveness, not reflection. The final frame must arise from genuine care, not strategic cunning. It should feel less like a trap and more like an offering. I'm not trying to corner you. I'm inviting you to consider what this means to you, at your core. The tone must be gentle, the phrasing open-ended, the intent rooted in shared values rather than personal victory. This reveals a profound truth about influence. The last word isn't spoken, it's planted. And questions are seeds. They don't force growth, they create the conditions for it. They lie dormant until watered by experience, sunlight by new perspective, or stirred by a moment of vulnerability. And when they sprout, the insight feels self-generated, which makes it far more durable than any externally imposed conclusion. Of course, even the most fertile seed may not take root immediately. Some minds are armored, some hearts guarded, some wounds too fresh for reflection. In those cases, no single question, however artful, will break through. But that doesn't mean the effort is wasted. Sometimes, the seed simply waits. And if they still resist, if the walls remain high and the silence unyielding, there is one final recourse: return, again and again, to your core truth, not with anger, not with repetition for its own sake, but with unwavering calm. Because persistence, when rooted in principle, becomes its own kind of poetry. A river doesn't argue with the rock. It flows, and flows, and flows, day after day, season after season, until the stone, once immovable, is smoothed into surrender. This is the quiet power of the broken record tactic, not force, not fury, but unwavering, gentle repetition. When all other strategies have been spent, when logic has been dismissed, empathy met with defensiveness, and silence filled with noise, the most potent move may simply be to return, again and again, to your core truth, spoken with the same calm clarity each time. You do not escalate. You do not deviate. You state your point, and when they deflect, deny, or distract, you say it again, unchanged, unruffled, unshaken. As I was saying, and in that constancy, something remarkable happens. Resistance begins to fatigue. This technique works because human psychology thrives on novelty, and tires of repetition. When someone expects you to chase their tangents, react to their provocations, or abandon your stance under pressure, your refusal to do so disrupts their script. Each time you circle back to your central point without anger or impatience, you signal two things. First, that this issue matters deeply enough to warrant consistency, and second, that you are not here to perform, but to persist. Over time, the other person's energy wanes. Their counterarguments grow thinner. Their interruptions lose steam. And in that exhaustion, emotional, cognitive, or moral, they often yield not because they've been overpowered, but because your calm repetition has made continued opposition feel futile, even petty. The broken record is not about stubbornness. It is about fidelity to your values, your boundaries, your truth. Consider a parent setting a limit. I understand you're upset, but you still need to finish your homework before screen time. The child protests, bargains, pleads. The parent doesn't argue each new point. They simply repeat, with kindness and firmness, homework first. No new justifications. No guilt. No wavering. That consistency becomes a form of love, a structure within which the child learns that some things are non-negotiable. In adult conflicts, the principle is the same. Whether you're advocating for ethical practices at work, upholding a personal boundary, or standing by a principle in a heated debate. Repeating your stance without aggression communicates integrity, not inflexibility. But this tactic demands immense self-control. It is easy to mistake repetition for rigidity, or calmness for coldness. The key lies in tone and presence. Your voice must remain steady, not robotic, your eyes open, not distant. You are not ignoring the other person, you are honoring them by refusing to be drawn into chaos. You say, "I hear your concern about timing, and I still believe this action is necessary," not "I already told you that." The former invites respect, the latter invites rebellion. The broken record only works when it is wrapped in patience, not punishment. This reveals a deeper truth about human change. It rarely comes from a single lightning bolt of insight, but from the steady drip of consistent truth. One drop means nothing. But drop after drop, over time, carves canyons. Your repeated statement becomes a landmark in the conversation, a fixed point around which the other person must eventually orient themselves. They may resist at first, but the mind seeks coherence, and your unwavering position creates a gravitational pull toward alignment. Of course, this approach is not for every situation. It is most effective when your position is clear, ethical, and grounded, not when you are clinging to ego or refusing to listen. Used wisely, the broken record is not a weapon of domination, but a vessel of conviction. It says, without words, this matters. I am here. And I will not disappear. And in the end, that quiet persistence may be the most persuasive force of all, not because it shouts the loudest, but because it refuses to be silenced. These 23 tricks are not weapons. They are not tools for domination, nor clever traps to ensnare the unwary. At their core, they are invitations, gentle, deliberate invitations to listen more deeply, to speak with greater clarity, and to connect more fully with the human being on the other side of the conversation. In a world that often equates persuasion with victory, it's easy to forget that true resolution isn't measured by who concedes first, but by whether both people walk away feeling seen, respected, and perhaps even changed. Because winning an argument means nothing if you lose the person. What good is being right if the bridge between you crumbles into silence? What value is there in triumph that leaves behind only distance? These techniques, when used with integrity, are acts of care disguised as strategy. They ask you to slow down when everything urges you to react. They invite you to see the fear beneath the anger, the longing beneath the criticism, the shared humanity beneath the disagreement. They remind you that influence is not about overpowering another's voice, but about creating enough space for truth to emerge, yours, theirs, and the one that lives between you. The goal is never to manipulate, but to illuminate, never to control, but to collaborate. So tonight, as you drift off into the quiet sanctuary of sleep, let this thought settle softly in your mind. The most powerful voice is not the loudest, the quickest, or the most certain. It is the one that helps others find their own. The voice that listens so well it gives the other person permission to hear themselves. The voice that speaks not to fill the silence, but to honor it. The voice that knows when to ask a question, when to pause, when to walk away, and when to return, again and again, with the same steady truth. May you carry these principles not as tactics to be deployed, but as reminders of your own capacity for grace in the face of friction. And may your conversations, whether spoken aloud or held in the quiet theater of your thoughts, become less about winning, and more about weaving the fragile, beautiful threads of understanding that bind us all. Sleep well,